Story 1. My dad was once dating a girl who was into golf. She took him to a major tournament to watch it with her and her dad. She was obsessed with one of the golfers there, so she and her dad woke up early to follow him. My dad slept in and wasn't interested in the golf, so he went to the nearby beach. There was a man there with windsurfing boards who decided to give one to my dad for free because everyone else was at the golf. He windsurfed for a couple of hours and then returned to the golf around hole 15. He met up with his girlfriend and her dad and lied, saying he walked around the holes and watched a few different people and everything went fine. He returned home and a few nights later went to her house for dinner. He sat down with a plate of lasagna, and while watching the golf reruns, the commentator panned out and zoomed in on my dad windsurfing, saying, "There's a lad who's not very interested in the golf." My dad was dumped on the spot. Story 2. This is a story about my grandfather who served in the Pacific Theater during World War II. As I was told, he was on patrol when an ambush occurred. While running back to his companions, a grenade landed at his feet. He picked it up and threw it back at the Japanese soldier who had thrown it, who in turn picked it up and threw it back. They played this game of catch for a few tosses before they both realized the grenade had not been primed. Grandfather looked at the soldier, and the soldier looked at him, and they both shrugged in a way that seemed to ask, "Do we really have to do this?" For the next toss, the soldier pulled the pin and lobbed the grenade far away from either of them, and they both went their separate ways. A few nights later, the soldier was found dead. Grandfather recognized him from a photo in a wallet that a serviceman had taken. Grandfather managed to retrieve the wallet, and years later he was able to return it to the family based on the information he found inside. Story 3. My dad is in his 70s and comes from a large family with 14 siblings. Money was very tight, so on Christmas they did not receive much and ended up sharing many of the gifts. He never really talked about the gifts he received but loved to tell us about Krampus. Apparently, on Christmas Eve, after the children had gone to sleep, they would dress in all black and kidnap the child who misbehaved the most and take them into the woods. They would then tie them to a tree and place coal around their feet. The children would wake up in the morning and have to figure out which child was missing and then go free them. When he talks about this, he conveys it as a fond memory. He mentioned that he was tied up only once, and it was very cold and scary. I guess it was an effective way to encourage the children to behave throughout the year. Story 4. A friend of mine shared that his dad watched the Beatles in Liverpool before they became famous at a small pub. The story goes that after the concert, he spoke to John Lennon and complimented the show, saying what a good band they were. Lennon responded, "You'll be paying to see us soon." Story 5. My dad was working in communications for the Air Force in Afghanistan in what was supposed to be a safe zone. While he was typing on his laptop, a bullet pierced the laptop, and my dad said his nose was about a foot away. Apparently, it was an ambush, and my dad's laptop caught the bullet, giving his team time to prepare for defense. My dad said he'd never been so scared in his life. Story 6. From my dad, but a story about my uncle. He grew up in a rough home situation and was adopted. He was about 8 years older than my dad. My uncle would take my dad out for treats and ice cream to help him escape from home fairly frequently. Once my dad was in high school, my uncle joined the Marines. In conversations with former classmates of my uncle, they often remarked on how tough and dangerous he was. Upon asking more questions, my dad discovered that my uncle was part of a fairly large underground bare-knuckle fight ring and fought for money, winning quite a lot apparently. That's how an unemployed high schooler could afford to go out and spend money by winning it. My dad believed it, especially since my uncle was discharged from the Marines for fighting his commanding officer during a disciplinary meeting. Story 7. My dad has a few pictures with him and Christopher Lee. At first, I didn't think much of it as he grew up in England and had pictures with many celebrities. I also have similar photos from attending conventions and various events. However, when going through his pictures after he passed away, I discovered photographs of him with General Horatius Murray, several pictures of him in uniform on a ship, and many other pieces of memorabilia. My dad taught me how to shoot a rifle when I was 6. After we moved to Florida, we would occasionally go to the shooting range. Once, when I was about 15, we went to the range. I had been shooting for a few years and had gotten pretty good at the 150-yard targets. I thought I was much better than my dad. Bet you can't do that, I challenged him. He responded, "You little rascal," and then took the Winchester Model 70 and fired 5 rounds in about 6 seconds, making it look like I was shooting while drunk and riding a unicycle. My dad and I didn't always get along, but this was one moment that left me in awe. Story 8. My dad is a doctor. He used to be called into the police station in the middle of the night to do driving under the influence assessments, usually checking blood or urine for alcohol or drugs. A woman arrived visibly drunk. She opted for a urine test instead of a blood test. She must have been there before because she knew a male police officer could not accompany her to oversee the sample collection. She went into the bathroom alone and emerged with the clearest urine sample one could ever see. My dad challenged her on this, accusing her of filling the collection bottle from the sink because he was absolutely certain he was holding a sample of water. She denied it, insisting it was urine. In a bold power play, he called her bluff and drank the sample. She was shocked but knew she was caught. My dad was quite proud recounting this story until I pointed out that she could have easily filled the bottle from the toilet bowl, to his horror. She eventually pleaded guilty to the driving under the influence charge, but not before trying to fight it on the basis that my dad was interfering with the sample. The case dragged on to the steps of the court, but ultimately she got nowhere since they had made her produce another sample, as the first one was deemed contaminated before my dad ever got his hands or lips on it. Story 9. When my dad was a small child, around 4 to 6 years old, he found and tamed a baby fox in the woods near his house. He brought it home, and his parents said he could keep it if he trained it and took care of it himself. They lived in very rural Newfoundland with farm animals, so the biggest concern was that he would harm the chickens. I guess he was trained well enough not to hurt any livestock at their house, but often the neighbors down the way reported foxes attacking their chickens. They threatened to shoot the fox if they ever saw it, and sure enough, one day it didn't return home. My dad always suspected it was them. That was after several years together, though, and my dad considered that fox one of his favorite pets in his entire life. He shared that with me in his final months. My advice to anyone with an ailing parent is to talk to them about their favorite memories. I had no idea my dad had lived such an interesting life, particularly from the ages of 4 to 14, until it was too late to hear it all. Story 10. My grandpa served in 3 wars: Vietnam, Korea, and World War II. He also served in different branches of the military just to see if they would let him. He never told me a single story about shooting anyone, just how happy he was when fresh apples were delivered and how they once stole horses from the Nazis. Story 11. My grandfather claimed he received his Purple Heart because another sailor was acting erratically and threatening people in the mess hall, so he knocked him out with an egg sandwich. To this day, I don't know who he took that Purple Heart from. Story 12. Dad was on the Special Weapons and Tactics team when I was a kid in the 1980s. He told me about a hostage situation in the middle of winter at 3 a.m. where a man barricaded himself in his house with his wife and children. My dad and his spotter needed a place to set up, but since it was downtown, the adjacent roof had too steep of an angle. They went to the second floor to unfortunately commandeer some poor tenant's window. He knocked on the door, and an elderly lady with curlers in her hair and a pink nightgown answered the door to 2 gentlemen who looked like action figures. They explained the situation and asked to use her window facing the street. She didn't say a word. She just led them to the bedroom, which contained her husband watching reruns of Sanford and Son in a bed that filled most of the tiny room, leaving the narrowest walking space around it. As Dad and his partner shuffled their way around the bed, the lady crawled back into bed next to her husband. They flung the window open, and a blast of cold air filled the room, causing the couple to pull the covers up to their chins. With no room to pull up a chair, Dad and his partner had to sit on the edge of the bed that was just big enough for the husband and wife. After about an hour, the hostage-taker came out of the house brandishing what looked like a gun toward the team on the street. Looking through the scope, Dad could tell it was a bedpost. He jumped on the radio, "No gun! No gun! No gun!" and prevented the man from committing suicide by cop. The couple continued watching television throughout this whole situation and seemed completely unconcerned. Dad thought it was a funny, surreal moment. Story 13. When my dad was a resident in a hospital in Flushing, Queens in the 1970s. He was driving his sky blue Chevy Malibu to work and listening to Cold as Ice by Foreigner when a 9-year-old boy with an impressive afro rode his bike straight into the side of his car. My dad was worried the boy might have a concussion, so he insisted on giving him a ride to the hospital to get a scan and have a family member pick him up. After the scan, the boy's 19-year-old brother arrived, dressed as Marilyn Monroe. The nurses, custodians, and other support staff burst into laughter as soon as he walked in. My dad was polite, and the brother thanked him before taking his sibling's hand and heading out. But he stopped at the exit, turned around, snatched off his blonde wig, and shouted in a deep baritone, F*** you, you jealous bitches, before departing. Story 14. One time when I was very young, my dad went to a friend's house to do a transaction. While he was there, the man had a new dog, a small cocker spaniel, that he was severely mistreating. All you had to do was look at it, and it would fall over and urinate on itself. It was truly heartbreaking. My dad got what he needed, stood up, picked up the dog and said, I'm taking your dog, and then just left with it. We had a new dog. Story 15. My dad is pretty ordinary. My ex-father-in-law, though, is something else. I think that man is a time traveler or a cat because he has had the most incredible life and should have been dead several times. He grew up in a tough environment with an alcoholic father and a stepmother who didn't want him after his mother abandoned them. He enlisted in the Navy, where he spent nearly 30 years, surviving a helicopter crash in the Indian Ocean and having lunch with President Reagan aboard his ship. He was stationed all around the world, eventually settling in Texas, where he divorced my ex-mother-in-law. He then embarked on a new career while saving his Navy money and pension. After a time of traveling like in the movie Nomad, he decided to settle in Minnesota, paying as much for a house as I paid for my car to be closer to my ex-wife while she was in college. There, he suffered a massive heart attack that destroyed half of his heart. He then developed endocarditis, was read his last rites, and remarkably survived that, continuing on as if nothing happened. He was later involved in a severe accident that required bone from other parts of his body to reconstruct his face. A few years later, he moved back to his hometown and suffered another heart attack, which claimed another quarter of his heart, but he survived again and even had a massive tumor removed from his pancreas. He collects old weapons of war, including sabers and guns, rides his bike more miles than I care to drive, has great popularity with the ladies in his hometown, and lives happily single with his dog, who adores him. Even though things didn't work out between his daughter and me, I will always respect that man's determination to live, though I think he is running out of lives. Story 16. In the late 1970s in Toronto, my dad heard that a troubled young man in the neighborhood had broken his girlfriend's arm because she wouldn't comply with his demands. My dad had no idea who she was, but being the kind of person he was, he found the young man and warned him that if he ever laid a hand on her again, he would face severe consequences. Although my dad was a nerd who loved Dungeons and Dragons, he was also a hockey star and had a strong presence. The young man never harmed her again. Later, my dad gave the girlfriend a ride home in the rain after she had been roller skating. They eventually married and had me 20 years later. Story 17. My dad was born in 1937, his brother in 1938, in Belgium from a Jewish family. When the war broke out, they hid him and his brother in 2 different Catholic families. Those families pretended that the boys were theirs. Everyone acted as if they believed it. They were even recorded in the church's register with a false date of birth, and they were baptized for real. The mothers were sisters, so until the end of the war, my father and my uncle believed they were cousins. At some point, near the end of the war, 2 Russian deserters, trying to get as far away from the war as possible, walked into the village asking for help. Since it was wartime, any help was welcome, and they became farmhands. One of the first things they did was gather scraps and a pressure cooker to build a still and make vodka from potato peels. One night, they got blind drunk, and my father, being mischievous, stole the gun of one of the soldiers, who rightfully became extremely angry. Once the war was over, his father came back to take them home. His mother did not make it. Because my father was the type of guy who would embellish the stories, I asked my uncle if it was true. He confirmed everything, including the story about the angry soldier. I asked about the gun, and he said, "I don't know," with a smile. In his language, it meant, "I know, but I won't tell." And my father smiled back. When I got older, he actually showed me the gun. It is a Tokarev TT-33. When my father died, I asked my mom where the gun was, and she answered, "Somewhere." Since the situation with this gun is very illegal in my country, I'm pretty sure it's still somewhere in the house. One of the Russian soldiers went back to Russia, while the other one married one of the farm girls. My family is still in touch with the families that adopted my father and my uncle. My uncle requested that a tree be planted for them at Yad Vashem, but I don't know if there is actually one. Story 18. I have many stories from my great-grandfather, some of which I know to be true and some that I choose to believe are lore. One story is that when he was drafted in World War II, he went for his medical evaluation and was casually chatting with the doctor. The doctor asked how many kids he had, and Papa responded, 7. The doctor was surprised and said they couldn't send a man with 7 young kids to war, so he ended up not having to go. Another more famous story is about how Papa came to only have half a pinky on his left hand. Growing up, he told us kids that it was because he liked to soak up leftover pancake syrup with that finger and had worn it down. As an adult, I discovered it was actually because my uncle accidentally hit his hand with a sledgehammer in their blacksmith shop about 40 years earlier. Before becoming a blacksmith, Papa and Grandma ran a farm in rural North Georgia. They had the usual animals: pigs, cows, chickens, and, for reasons no one has been able to adequately explain, 2 parrots. When I asked my grandmother where her parents got the parrots and why, she gave me a look as if those were questions she had never considered before. Those are just a few of my favorites. He was the best, wittiest person I've ever known, and he led an incredibly interesting life. Story 19. So this would have been around 1990. My dad once had a friend named Alex in college. Alex had a really nice sofa that he decided to lend to a girl for the semester since she had rented a house. A few months later, there was a massive party at this house. My dad was there and started looking for the couch, but he couldn't seem to find it anywhere. He went to Alex and told him his couch seemed to be missing. Alex freaked out and said, "My parents are going to kill me if I don't get it back. We have to find it." My dad promised to find it for Alex and first asked the girl whose house it was. She told him it was in the basement, but my dad had already seen it wasn't there. He went around and asked more people at the party, but nobody seemed to know where it was until an old man who looked very out of place at the party nodded when my dad asked him if he knew where the couch was. He said, "Go get me a pencil and paper. I'll draw you a map." He drew a map and explained the directions, and my dad understood. The next day, Alex couldn't go with my dad to get the couch, so he went with his other friend, whom I'll call Larry, while borrowing Alex's truck. They followed the map in the truck, but it took them to an old abandoned house. They double-checked to see if it was the place, and it seemed to line up. My dad refused to go in, so Larry had to go into the house alone. Larry entered the abandoned house, and not even 10 seconds later, he came running out to the truck, white as a ghost. He started yelling to just drive before my dad could ask what happened. My dad asked, "Did you see the couch? What happened?" Larry explained, "No, what had happened was Larry walked up to the house, pushed the door open, which was unlocked, and saw a person slumped over on the floor, unsure if he was dead or alive, and just left. To this day, the couch has never been found." Story 20. Sometime in the 1970s, my dad went to see Tom Waits perform in a dive bar in downtown Denver. A drunken, passed-out man was in the doorway, and my dad realized it was William S. Burroughs. He had to step over Burroughs to get in and see Tom Waits. Legend. Story 21. My dad was in the Oklahoma City Federal Building when it was bombed. He exited the elevator just minutes before the blast, which would have killed him if he had been on the elevator any longer. He saved some people, went back in and saved more, then spoke on Good Morning America. Story 22. My dad was a tough old man. I remember when he needed knee replacement surgery. During the consultation, the doctor asked if he had ever broken any bones, and he said no. After the procedure, The doctor asked why he hadn't mentioned that he had broken his leg previously. My dad replied, "Oh, was it broken? I did hurt my leg many years ago, but I just walked on it until it felt better." Story 23. My dad dropped out of college in the 1960s and was almost immediately drafted. He recognized the letter, so instead of opening it, he ran to a Navy recruiter and enlisted in the Navy. The Army actually tried to get him from the Navy, but they weren't going to let go of a guy who was really good at math and was a high school letterman who won numerous medals for track. So he stayed in the Navy. During boot camp for the Navy, he was sent to an office to talk to an officer. The officer explained that there was a new unit within the Navy that was started by President Kennedy. My dad said that back then, if someone mentioned John F. Kennedy, you jumped at the chance to be a part of whatever was being talked about. As this officer explained the unit to my dad, he just asked, "You mean like frogmen?" The officer replied, No, this is completely different. They're called the SEALs." My dad turned them down and still ended up in Vietnam on a riverboat. Story 24. My dad went to see Jerry Garcia at a small club to watch him play with his band, not the Grateful Dead. He sat down with his friend, who was recording the show to listen to later. The person who joined them at their table was John Lennon. They spent the whole night with him, and people brought him all kinds of drugs, including marijuana. He shared them with my dad and his friend, who said he didn't need them. They had a great time. Their favorite part was when he would take the recorder microphone and provide commentary on the music. They have a complete recording of Jerry Garcia with John Lennon's commentary, and we still have the audio. Story 25. My dad was an airline pilot his whole life. In 2011, he was ferrying a Boeing 737 that belonged to a wealthy sheik. He was third in line for takeoff with two other aircraft behind him. The first plane took off, and with no other aircraft on final approach for the runway, everyone on frequency expected air traffic control to instruct the second plane to either line up and wait or enter the runway and take off immediately. The second plane started asking air traffic control for instructions, but there was no response, only total radio silence for about 5 minutes. Suddenly, they heard loud booms, even over the noise of the jets, and saw tanks, artillery, and military trucks breaching the fences at Tripoli airport. Next thing you know, the third plane started yelling on the radio for the first plane to take off quickly because Muammar Gaddafi had just been deposed. As soon as this was said, everyone started rushing to take off from whatever ground they could use as a runway, with explosions and chaos behind them, desperately trying to escape Libyan airspace and climbing out while performing evasive maneuvers, believing they were being shot at from the ground. Story 26. When my grandfather was a child, his parents were going through a difficult divorce. His father would abuse his mother and siblings consistently. One day, his father caught his mother at the store, took all of the children except the one who was with her, and fled across the country to California. During the 1960s, they had no contact with their mother for 3 years. When Grandpa turned 14, he decided he was tired of the abuse. He stole his older brother's identification and a small television from his father's room, which he sold at a pawn shop for a fraction of its value. He then hitchhiked across the United States and almost made it back to Ohio before being arrested in Illinois for getting into a fight with someone who was trying to rob him. Once he revealed his true identity to the police, they contacted the Cleveland Police Department, which confirmed he was a missing child who had disappeared 3 years earlier. Thankfully, they were able to reunite him with his mother. His other 3 siblings were not brought back until 4 years later when the oldest child stole their father's car in the middle of the night. Story 27. My family is from Wisconsin. One year, my parents decided to go on a vacation to Australia and New Zealand. While they were there, they chose to hike a popular mountain range in New Zealand. While hiking, my dad heard someone yell his first name. Thinking there was no way anyone on the opposite side of the world could possibly know him, he didn't even look and just kept walking. Then the person yelled his first and last name, which is not a common last name at all. My dad turned around and saw our next-door neighbor. Our neighbors from a small town in Wisconsin happened to go on vacation at the same time of year, to the same country, and decided to hike up the same mountain as my parents. The incredible level of coincidence almost convinced me we are all living in a simulated reality. Story 28. My dad was in the Army Reserve. He needed to take a group of soldiers down to Virginia, so he thought it would be nice to rent a bus and have his team pass by Washington, D.C. on their way down. Apparently, the soldiers annoyed the bus driver so much that he stopped in front of the White House, tossed the bus keys onto the lawn, and stormed off. Story 29. My dad had a class field trip to a keychain-making factory when he was young. They showed the big grinder where they make the letters and gave each child a block to create their own. My dad leaned too far in, and the machine took the top part of his finger off. If he pinched the middle part that remained, it would stop the bleeding. He used his finger like a squirt gun and scared some other kids. Story 30. My grandmother's brother, my great-uncle, flew over the Himalayas from India to China. One night, while they were somewhere in China, several of them got drunk and stole a train. Note that they did not rob the train. They stole it. Story 31. I think this will fit in here. My dad was 16, living in Germany. His stepfather was stationed there. He had heard some buzz about a new movie, Star Wars. There was one theater that would play one American movie every couple of weeks, and finally Star Wars was coming. Dad saw the film and was totally blown away. He got into his aunt's car to ride home, ready to revel in the glory of everything he just experienced. Space battles, lightsabers, Darth Vader, Han Solo, lasers, and more. Instead, he was met by his aunt, who was uncontrollably sobbing. She looked back and exclaimed, "Elvis is dead," and continued to cry. She blared the radio and sang through her tears the whole drive home. That's the day my dad decided he hates Elvis. Story 32. My mom told me the story my grandfather shared with her about his time in the Pacific during World War II. After several days of rough jungle combat in the Philippines, he wanted to get drunk. He was not a critical thinker, so he sneaked into the medical tent and drank antiseptic alcohol. He became very ill, mistakenly believing all alcohol was the same. He mentioned being on his hands and knees right outside the tent, violently vomiting. I know it's not a wild or heroic war story, but I always found that family lore hilarious. Story 33. I have a grandfather. My grandfather worked on the B-2 stealth bomber. He was a radar technician in the Air National Guard, earned his associate degree in electrical engineering, and worked at RCA until he retired. There was a time when he was working on the B-2 and told my grandmother he had to do short-term travel for work. He went to China Lake, worked on it for a few months, then returned to his regular duties. He showed my father a picture of it from when my father was a teenager before the B-2 was public. Story 34. My uncle told me this story years after my dad had passed away. My dad grew up in a farm town in western Pennsylvania in the 1960s. Being a teenager in a remote area during that time, he was known to enjoy some drinks here and there. One night, he got home and was visibly intoxicated. According to my uncle, he sat in a chair facing the front window and stared into the darkness for several minutes. This was in full view of the entire family. My grandfather asked him, "Jim, why don't you go to bed?" My father replied, "I'm waiting until the cows come home." My grandfather thought he was being sarcastic and told him to go to bed. Then he looked out the window and saw a herd of cows crossing the road into the yard. Story 35. My dad served as an engineer in the United States Air Force and was stationed in Thailand for a time. I don't know any specifics about his job or position. He doesn't like to talk about it much. However, he tells a story about a man off base who would sell soldiers a large shoebox filled to the top with marijuana for $5, and how after going through one such box with his friends, he went back and purchased another. The second box, unbeknownst to him at the time, was laced with some kind of heroin. One night at a party, after finishing a joint, he stood up to go to the bathroom and suddenly found himself having an out-of-body experience. He says he was floating about 5 feet behind his back as his body moved around, like a third-person video game, just going about his business. This lasted for something like 2 weeks. For 2 weeks, he watched himself wander around the base, eat, sleep, and work, checking the wiring on jet planes and whatnot, just freaking out and praying the whole time to get back into his body. Eventually, after many promises to never smoke weed again and begging God to let him back into his body, he woke up just fine and in first person. It's a fun story to me. And when I tell my friends, they usually say something like, "Damn, I want to get as high as your dad." Even though he laughs it off now every time he talks about it, he still seems legitimately shaken by the experience. Story 36. My dad was an emergency medical technician at the time. He was at the local hospital and stopped in to see his friend who was a radiologist. The radiologist mentioned that the patient he was x-raying had a pool cue ball lodged in his rectum. Dad asked what happened, and he explained that the man was walking by a pool hall, got mugged, and since he didn't have any money, the assailants became angry and shoved a cue ball up him. My dad replied, "It's a good thing you weren't walking past a bowling alley." I know it's an old joke, but Dad did have a good friend who was a radiologist, so I believed it for years. Story 37. My dad was stuck in Canada for a work conference when September 11th occurred. He had a panicked wife and a 4-year-old child at home that he couldn't easily contact, and border security was nearly completely frozen. One night, while he was anxiously waiting for any progress on his ability to return to America, he and his co-workers went to a bar where some locals recognized their situation and hailed them as heroes, despite their not having done anything significant. Eventually, when security eased enough for him to re-enter the United States with 3 forms of identification, he returned home using his driver's license, his work ID, and his membership card. Story 38. The first emergency response call my father attended. After earning a bachelor's degree and teaching 8th grade history for a year, my dad decided to join the California Department of Forestry, which was the state's fire service at the time, now known as CAL FIRE. Firefighters weren't always medical responders, and when that became part of the job, my dad was appointed to lead medical responses. This was primarily because he took a first aid class in college to fulfill a health requirement for his liberal arts degree, not due to any extensive training or experience. The first call the team responded to involved an unresponsive elderly person in a nursing home. My dad began cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Interestingly, vomiting is a common response from a person receiving CPR. Additionally, mouth barriers were not used before the AIDS epidemic. You can see where this is going. The elderly man, still unresponsive, vomited into my dad's mouth. Not knowing what to do, and not expecting this, my dad turned his head and also vomited. The other person assisting him with CPR must have been a sympathetic vomiter, as were the surrounding firefighters. It became a chaotic scene, and unfortunately, the elderly man did not survive. This is probably the most lighthearted of firefighter stories I have heard. The next one involved my dad and other firefighters playing a real-life game of whack-a-mole, except it was whack flaming rabbits with shovels on a rural road to prevent the spread of a fire from one side of the road to the other due to escaping bunnies engulfed in flames. Story 39. My dad is at an age when he gets drunk and starts talking about things he never mentioned, like jumping out of airplanes with a nuclear backpack. He was in the Special Forces. Story 40. Not my dad, but my paternal grandfather. He was born in 1919 and served in World War II. He was injured and sent back home to Melbourne, Australia. He met and married my grandmother shortly afterwards, and my dad was born in 1946, right as the war ended. My dad and grandmother were never clear on the nature of his injury, just that he was missing a couple of fingers when he came back. The best part about his story is that nobody knows how he lost the fingers. He told a different story to everyone who asked. He told me when I was 8 that his finger got caught between 2 cars and he had to cut it off. He told my 4-year-old brother that a bird had carried it away. He told my dad a different story every time, but those stories always involved a boat, so my dad always suspected it had something to do with a boat. My Nana said that he told her he did it on purpose so he would never have to wear a wedding ring, except he didn't meet her until after he was sent home, and he just wore his wedding ring on his pinky. Anyway, he led an honest life in Australia as a mechanic and was never held back by his injury. It was just his sense of humor to mess with people. He died in 2003, and the mystery of how he lost his fingers still remains. Every now and then, we laugh about it at a family gathering. Story 41. My dad's alternator belt broke while he was on a date. He read in a magazine that pantyhose can be used as a quick fix. He used her pantyhose. He said the date was fun. Story 42. My stepdad, who has since passed away, served in the military during the Vietnam War and for about a decade afterward. On his last mission, his helicopter was shot down, and he was the only survivor out of 11. After the crash, he looked down at himself and saw that his stomach was split open and all his organs had fallen out. He pushed them back inside and used his belt to hold everything together until help arrived. He ended up with some digestive issues from this and had to have his spleen completely removed, but otherwise he ended up physically okay. The post-traumatic stress disorder affected him deeply, but he did his best not to let it impact me and my mom. He was the best father figure I could have ever asked for. He received an honorable discharge and a Purple Heart. He shared many stories with me, some incredibly heroic and others truly sad, but this is the one that stands out to me, highlighting how strong and capable he was as a person. He died 19 years ago, and I miss him every single day. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.